Okay, friends, welcome to our public conference. I'm Bob Russell. I'm the Ian G. Barber Professor of Theology and Science here at the GTU and founder and director of the Center for Theology and the Natural Sciences. Pleasure to welcome you all here to this public conference. Talk a little louder. Okay, Mark, thank you. Definitely. So our project is sort of teasingly termed Saturn. That stands for Scientific and Theological Understandings of Randomness in Nature. It comes out of a general question, which is most Jews, Christians, and Muslims believe God acts in the world to achieve specific events, not just to give existence to the world, which of course God does, and to give sort of general providence to the world, but response to prayer, acts in salvation history. There are testimonies of miracles in both Hebrew Bible and Christian scripture and the Quran. So the question is, if one believes that, and I happen to believe that, is science a partner or a foe in sort of integrating those parts of our tradition or our culture? Is science an enemy that defeats any claim to divine action in special terms? So you needn't pray except to sort of adjust yourself to a kind of fatalistic view of the world. Or if God chooses to act, does science point to ways in which that might be plausible or intelligible? I don't think any of us here in the research are trying to prove something about God. Quite the opposite. Some of us start from the faith tradition that assumes God acts. I think the great news of the 20th and 21st century, both science and philosophy of science, is that you can start with that faith premise and you can make an intelligible claim about it in light of science, sort of fideis quorens intellectum, faith seeking understanding. Some of this initial research was done by 4 or 5 of us out of the 50 of us who participated in the 20-year-long Vatican Observatory CTNS series of research conferences. There were a wide variety of topics. This is a tiny part of that. So please don't, label the entire research program as just this. But it's one I'm particularly interested in. I've been fortunate enough to be able to continue it here at the GTU. And thanks to a very generous grant from Calvin College through mathematician Jim Bradley, we were able to get a small grant, $200,000, to work with a team of scholars for over a year now online, exchanging papers about these topics you'll see today. And the last 2 days, we met here in Berkeley in a private research session to sort of drum out the arguments, see what we've come to. And today is a chance to briefly share some of these results with you. We intend to get a book out from it, and that'll be another avenue. And Ted and I and others are going to develop courses here at the GTU at the MDiv level, MA and doctoral level that incorporates this research to the wider GTU Berkeley community. So again, it's an interesting set of research. It's an example of what I call interaction between theology and science, where there's genuine conversation, genuine learning, and one of which I think you could say new ground has been forged. Now, in my own work, and I'm going to switch orders with Jerry and go first on quantum mechanics, and Jerry will do quantum cosmology, so he and I bookend the conference. On my own work, I've tried to make the case that some interpretations of quantum mechanics, namely Heisenberg's, allows you to say, yeah, it's intelligible that God can achieve a difference in the development of nature that nature on her own wouldn't have achieved, but without violating the process of nature, without violating the laws of nature. And it's possible to do that. And I call that narrative. Others are going to take different approaches to the problem. The general goal of this Saturn research is to say most of us in the group believe that God acts certainly not just at the microscopic level, that'd be absurd, but God acts throughout the world in all levels of complexity, all levels of diversity, from physics to evolution to ecology to neuroscience, psychological science, spirituality. All those fields are somehow testimonies to divine action. And this particular research has been a chance to broaden the argument from the sort of beachhead in quantum mechanics, which I think is a fairly stable, pretty convincing argument if you are open to divine action and think science should have a say in it and think philosophy of science mediates. I think what we're trying to do here is say, is it actually the case that at many levels of complexity in nature, particularly the biological and mental, neurological levels where really interesting new developments in the philosophy of science have opened up the conversation, perhaps reintroducing Aristotle's four causes and other arguments like that. Is it the case that, in fact, you can make a much wider, grander spectrum, right, of views, kind of rainbow of views, of the ways in which it's intelligible to think of divine action? Again, it's not a proof. We're not starting from science and proving God, quite the opposite. But it is an interaction in which science counts, and it's even possible that some of the things we say theologically could have implications for the kind of scientific research you would do. So it really does loop back on itself. Okay. Well, today's agenda is going to be a lot of fun. We're going to have 4 presentations and then a break, 4 more and a break. Each presentation is basically a 20-minute slot. So the speaker has 10 to 15 minutes to summarize their work, 5 to 10 minutes for just Q&A with all of you. And I'll ask you to raise questions, not make long statements, but questions. And we'll go through the 4, then have our break. So that's the procedure. And then, of course, during the 20-minute break in the middle, do what you like, ask whatever you want. Well, thanks for coming. And any questions of the procedure for today before we begin? So I did a journal essay years ago playing on the term the God who acts. Those of you from the G2 are very familiar with this phrase. And I simply said, is it true? Does the God who act really act? And my task was to say, well, quantum mechanics sheds light on a non-interventionist account of divine action. And there are advantages and problems. So this is meant to set the stage a little bit for that claim and really for today's whole presentation. So here's a kind of background to the problem. 18th and 19th century context, classical mechanics, reality is matter in motion, an atomistic view of the world. Motion is fully deterministic through Laplacian determinism, and you get the so-called mechanistic worldview. Consequences for Christian theology. Here I'm really indebted to my colleague and dear friend Nancy Murphy, who's argued that this framework, this mechanistic framework with its atomism and reductionism and determinism, sets up a forced option that isn't between, say, Catholics and Protestants, right? It's between conservatives and liberals. Conservatives are willing to go to the mat for divine action, even if it means you have to somehow challenge science. Liberals want peace of science and are willing to atrophy the notion of divine action simply being an interpretation, right? So I think the eclipse is amazing, but it's really a natural event, nothing unusual about the eclipse. Here's 2 great quotes from the 20th century to show that it isn't just the handful of us that are worried about this problem. Here's Bullman. I need to see the worldly events as linked by cause and effect. There remains no room for God's working. It's 1958. This isn't, 200 years ago. And then I think in one of the most compelling, sort of emotive accounts from Gilkey, who was really capable of writing in a way that pulls your heartstrings. The Bible is a book descriptive not of the acts of God, but of Hebrew religion. Not great. It is a book of the acts Hebrews believed God might have done, and the words, he might have said, had he done and said them, but of course we recognize he didn't. So, Religious Studies 101. So, at least for myself, and there are other scholars in the room, Michael is here, and Michael has written a great book recently on divine action, takes a very different approach as a neo-Thomist, but for myself, I'm going to look for a non-interventionist of divine action. Basically, God acts in nature not only as creator everywhere, and in terms of general providence, but in cases of special providence. Right? God acts to make a difference in what would have otherwise happened had God not acted specially, but just generally, and does so without intervening or disrupting natural processes. Quick thumbnail sketch of of non-interventionist divine action. God acts. God's already present, immanent in nature. God doesn't inject God's self into nature. That's absurd. But God acts without becoming a natural cause. And the key here, to put it in a very simple way, is that nature is not a machine, but it's some sort of open dynamical system, right? And that means that it's pliable, it's flexible. From a quantum mechanics point of view, you're going to say the future has a set of possibilities. One becomes actual. It's an actualization of possibilities, not a pushing around through efficient codes. So if you can make a case for a philosophical view of nature, which is not deterministic but open, if you can make that case, then you can import that into your theology and have an account of divine action, which is non-interventionist. So you see the direction. It goes from this theologically motivated philosophical account of nature to then say, well, are there areas in science which would be open to that interpretation? And I'm going to make the case, yes. There are many, I think, but certainly there's quantum mechanics. And my colleagues are going to say, yes, there are other ones too, and there are many philosophical tools you could use to unpack that claim. Okay. So, quick chart. Theory of divine action, DA. If you live in a deterministic, mechanistic world, you can have a subjective account or an objective account. So the eclipse is beautiful, but it's a regular phenomenon, versus a healing miracle, where something really does happen. And those typically, I would term them non-interventionist and interventionist. And of course, that's the split that Nancy talks so wonderfully about between liberals and conservatives. Now, notice, just as a matter of fact, that this divide amongst Christians is not caused by the Bible. It's not caused by their denomination. It's caused by a philosophical interpretation of nature. So it means that we're all playing basketball, and then some voice says, stop playing basketball and play football. And we just do it. But that voice isn't part of the conversation. It's not like the Pope said it, right? Or the bishop said it. It's somebody else. It's philosophy of nature that's saying it. So that's part of the whole puzzle, that we have allowed that philosophical view to play such a determinative role within the church. Now, if you live in an indeterministic world, which I think you do at the quantum level, and personally I think you do at many levels, but we're trying to make that case academically, you still have subjective or objective interpretations. Obviously, you can still do either one. But now, you can still give a liberal account or a conservative account, but there's a third account. There's a third philosophical option. Now, the non-interventionist divine action. It's a new tool in your toolkit. It's a new philosophical view of nature. It's precisely because it's indeterministic that you can get this account. Now, whether any theologian is interested in that or not is a good question. Michael and I debated that. Whether any science can be interpreted this way is a good question. I think quantum mechanics can. But I want to start by saying this is a new philosophical mode which is generated because of this indeterministic account of nature. And then it's appropriated or not by theologians and based on one of science. So, for example, we're going to hear today about string theory, multiverse theory, evolutionary biology and ecology, self-organizing systems with context-sensitive constraints. Let's start with quantum mechanics. So I think quantum mechanics is good news for us. It can be interpreted in terms of indeterminism. It also has 6, 8, 10 other very robust interpretations. Some may seem a little bit odd, but to date, no one has shown definitively that one of the 8 is really the right one. So we're in a really interesting situation in history where you have, a theory that's been around for a century, and yet there are strong competing interpretations and no one knows what to do. Some don't even talk about it because why get into that complicated situation? But my feeling is, well, you can't go back to classical mechanics. You might as well go forward. This is the way you go forward. So take an interpretation and see what it says with a big what if around it. What if it's wrong? And that's true. So it can be interpreted that way. And in a sense of lakatos, there's additional word for it. It's progressive because it can be applied to an area it wasn't designed to account for originally. That is, it could be applied to evolution. in support of theistic evolution, that God acts through evolution to produce biological complexity, the diversity of species. And that's because every genetic mutation ultimately relies upon a quantum mechanical process of making or breaking a hydrogen bond. So the very place where Dawkins says, God can't be working there, it's totally random, is in fact God working there. And science knows it in the sense of randomness, but only eyes of faith can see that this is divinity, not just pure randomness. Okay, so we're almost done here. I'm claiming that a quantum mechanical based account of Nauta can be used not just for physics, but for evolution to augment a story of nature as God's creation, to which God is immanently present as spirit, and then it extrapolates the diversity of nature over geological eons. What science discovers as chance in evolution can be interpreted in terms of ontological indeterminism, true indeterminism in the world, and therefore the result of God's special action. God doesn't watch the statistics and account for them. God's action produces the statistics. So that's how God creates life. Finally, no need for an interventionist theology of divine action, attempting to introduce a design agent along with variation selection. So ID is now superfluous. It's basically unnecessary, unhelpful. So it's superfluous. If this is right, ID is over, in principle. And Monod is finally defeated. Because precisely what he claims to be the blindness, the dysteleological, the anti-purposeful, or the lack of purpose, is the way God's purposes are expressed in nature, which appears to be chance, right? And so if this argument for quantum-based Nauta makes sense, it can be applied in a Lakatosian sense to a wider canvas with additional progressive results, namely ideas out and atheistic Darwin is out. Thanks. Okay, 5 minutes for Q&A. Yes, please. Go ahead, please.
Okay.
It's brief.
Expand a little bit on what actions you personally feel motivate you to this. You mentioned evolution. Now, I deal mathematical evolution by retrocausality.
Sure.
The task is forced by the present to be the way it is, which is purely mathematical.
Yeah.
But what personal actions have you experienced or talked about that you think are most important and motivate you to this program?
Well, that's a really good question. What motivates me personally is my attempt as a theologian to find some sort of accord with science and be willing to risk a clash. So when I talk about cosmology, there are a lot of clashes there. But here it's quite interesting that, in fact, setting out to say, is there any area in science that would support Nauta? I think quantum mechanics does. Then to say, well, wait a second, that's got a surplus advantage because it applies elsewhere. And so I think that's a very elegant sense of progress in research. Again, using a Lakatosian notion of progress. Others? Yeah.
Just a question about non-interventionist. And by that you
Yes.
don't mean non-causal, do you? Or does this suggest that there might be other forms of causality, formal or final, other than efficient and material, to use the Aristotelian?
Yeah, yes, I'm very interested in the retrieval of Aristotle's full set of causes, as is Alicia, who will speak today, and Michael Dodds, of course. But what's interesting here is it's almost the flip side. It's the lack of an efficient cause. So I'm not going to say the form that divine action takes here is final or formal, although you could make the case. I'm going to say God acts in a way we don't have a category for because there is no natural form of cause operating here to bring about the effect. Now that's strictly Copenhagen. If you're Bohm or von Wagner or others, you'll have a different account.
So since you're saying by faith, or we think there is a cause, we don't know what form of causality it is?
Well, no, I'm saying more than that. I'm saying if Copenhagen were correct, we know something about nature. We know there is no efficient cause in these events. So I'm basing it on what we know from nature through a philosophical interpretation of nature. It's not a God of the gaps argument. It's a knowledge-based argument, but I'm acknowledging that that claim has a bracket around it saying it could be wrong. But the claim is, and most physicists agree, that there is no efficient cause. When the radioactive atom decays, nothing made it happen. Yeah, Mark?
How would you rate iota process theology?
Well, it could be used by process theology. I'm not a process theologian, but it could be used by them. Process people typically make a different kind of case. They make a metaphysical argument for divine agency. They'll say within what is truly actual, in actual occasion, you have the effect of the past, which is through prehension. They'll talk about God's subjective lure to the best possible outcome. It's a lure, not a force. And then intrinsic novelty as the thing perishes. And so Ian Barber will use quantum mechanics to say that sort of helps because it's saying nature really is open and flexible and not determined. But you've still got to make the case for quantum mechanics to come in. Otherwise, you've got a metaphysics without any application. If you're in a straitjacket, no matter how free you think you are, you can't move. Mark?
Well, I was going back to the first question because what interested me is conceptually, I think I grasp where you're going. Could you name instances where you think this may apply to this particular case in evolutionary biology, for example,
right,
where we see this exquisite combination of randomness and order, and we have this moment here, and here's particular cases where I would point to and say this.
Well, thank you, Mark. I guess I'm actually making a more diffuse comment. I'm really saying that there's such a ubiquitous role of randomness in evolution, right? Both through mitosis, meiosis, right, and through mutation and elsewhere. That in some ways, whenever those processes involve quantum mechanics, and they almost always do, ultimately, because they're talking about molecules being stretched or cut or so on, then we can see God at work. Now, that does, of course, exacerbate the problem with theodicy, of suffering in nature. There's no question. In every paper I've written, I've always said that, right? Does it make this impossible? Well, Arthur Pickett would say yes. But then Arthur pushes the puck back to the beginning. And then you have to ask, well, why would a God act almost deistically to set up a universe in which it's inevitable that you get the suffering of nature? I'd rather have God active in that process because I think God is redeeming nature, not creating suffering. So there's a whole response to theodicy in it. Let's take one more. Adrian, one more. Yeah.
Yeah, I think this reduces to just a question about physics.
Okay.
The setups, you can imagine some scenarios where, for example, the mutations during evolutionary history, where quantum effects have a cascade effect in the future.
Yeah.
Or by action. But if you, what is the scope for the larger scale effects? As I'm confused about two choices. If you were to look at a large set of lots of molecules, one of two things can happen. Either the quantum indeterminacy at small scale averages out and washes out. And so if that's the case, then quantum indeterminacy doesn't account for divine action at large scales. Or, and this is actually the question, if you had the means to affect the quantum states of all the billions and trillions of atoms, what is the most dramatic thing that you could do? I mean, can you things set bound for what God would do, and say it's only affecting quantum states?
Yeah, I got it.
At a large
Let me give a brief, that's a great question. Let me give a brief response. One critique of this is you never get macroscopic states. All these average out. That's why wood is hard. Okay, because average Fairbairn statistics. But it's not the case. Photomultipliers give you a specific macroscopic state for one microscopic state.
So that's the easy scenario. What about the hard scenario? That's if I were to move a table.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's why I think quantum mechanics isn't the only way to divine action. Right? It just I don't have the tools yet. But we're getting the tools, I think. But we don't have them yet to say, everything from quantum states that occasionally get amplified, right, to full-scale states that you and I might even call a miracle, are somehow more intelligible in this light. If you can make a case for ontological openness at many levels of nature, then I think it's easy to say, yeah, things like the Exodus really are true. We need to move on. So I just want to say, this is a piece of the problem. I'm not claiming it's the only one. I'm not claiming it's the unique one. But it is really important to theistic evolution, which I think has been kind of treading water since Arthur talked about it in 79 Abandoned Lectures, and that's 30 years ago. So I think this really delivers on that promissory note. And I think you can find in George Ellis and I have written lots of cases of amplification where you really do get a difference in human history. The simplest example would be to combine this with John Polkinghorne's chaos theory and say it's ultimately the quantum indeterminacy in the initial conditions that get amplified through chaotic systems or self-organizing systems or autopoietic systems that give you bulk effects, right? But we don't have a theory that links quantum mechanics with these larger scale phenomena. So although I think that's what's happening, I can't give you a theoretical account of it. Okay, thank you all. Let's move on. Next, Jerry.